Hello, my name is Melinscak and this is a pre-recorded presentation for the 2020 meeting of the Society for Mathematical Psychology. In this presentation, I will talk about how we can computationally optimize associative learning experiments. When most psychologists think about associative learning, they probably think about its empirical aspects. So for example, the foundational studies on classical and instrumental conditioning by people like Pavlov and Skinner. More clinically minded psychologists may also think about fear conditioning, which is a special case of associative learning and is also a model of anxiety disorders and provides a rationale for their treatments such as exposure therapy. However, mathematical psychologists may think about the long tradition of formal mathematical modeling, with the most prominent and most influential example being found in the Rescorla-Wagner model from the 1970s. Although this strong theoretical tradition of formal modeling in associative learning is generally an asset for the field, it also engenders a specific challenge. In particular, when there is this growing set of increasingly complex and flexible models, with some of them only being subtly different one from another, designing informative experiments becomes a real challenge. Regardless of whether your research aims are basic or applied, a central question then is how to choose an experiment that best fulfills those goals. And those goals may be, for example, model selection between different theoretically motivated models, or for example, parameter estimation of a particular model, or it may be something applied even like behavior change. And in this presentation, I want to show that the answer to these kinds of questions is to employ optimal experimental design. Now, when we want to employ optimal experimental design, we are actually in luck because the most important principles have already been understood from the 1950s, starting with Dennis Lindley. And the main idea here is to think about experimental design as a decision-making problem and then to apply Bayesian decision theory. And this entails abiding by two principles. One is to average or integrate over all the uncertainties, and the other one is to choose those actions that maximize expected utility. We can illustrate this process with a decision tree. In this decision tree, the square nodes are our decisions, and the round nodes are stochastic outcomes that are outside of our direct influence. So, on one hand, we have a ground truth model, and we have some parameters of this model that, together with our chosen design, generate the data. And then with this observed data, we perform some analysis that we also choose, and then we obtain some result. Now we can apply the principles of Bayesian decision theory to this decision problem. And what we find is that we need to choose that design that maximizes expected utility of the experiment. And here the expected utility is calculated with respect to a probability distribution across all the data sets, all the parameters, and all the models that could generate the data sets. So this turns out to be quite a challenging optimization problem. Nevertheless, let us now try to apply this idea of Bayesian optimal experimental design to designing associative learning experiments. Although computational problems that arise in experimental design can be quite challenging, the conceptual cookbook is actually quite simple. We can decompose the problem of designing optimized experiments into three steps. First one is to formalize the experiment. The second one is to find a way of evaluating experiments, or in other words, to calculate their expected utility. And the third one is to optimize them. So in other words, to search for the experiment that maximizes expected utility. Let us now apply this cookbook to classical conditioning experiments as a special case of associative learning. In particular, we are going to focus on optimizing statistical contingencies in the experiment because this is what saliently drives learning. Given this goal, we can formalize trials of classical conditioning as small Markov chains. And in particular, we have on the one side the probabilities of presenting different cues or conditioned stimuli, and then following each cue, we have conditional probabilities of different outcomes. So for example, cues could be different colors, and outcomes could be presence or absence of electrical shocks. These probabilities of presenting different cues and presenting different outcomes after cues have the role of transition probabilities in this Markov chain. So in other words, we have now formalized conditioning trials as Markov chains, this is the experiment structure, and the parameters of the experiment, or so-called design variables, are these state transition probabilities, and they are the ones that we are going to try to optimize. The next step is to find a way to actually calculate the utility of a particular design or a particular setting of the design variables. Generally speaking, calculating the utility is not a closed form problem, so there is usually not an analytical solution to this problem. However, a very general way of solving the problem is to use Monte Carlo simulations. This procedure is illustrated in the figure here. So, the light blue colored boxes, these are the user inputs to the method. And in particular, we have a proposed design. So in the case of classical conditioning, as we have formalized it, these are the transition probabilities. So how often are we going to show different cues, and how often are these cues going to be reinforced? This proposed design is then evaluated in a number of simulations. In each simulation, we first sample a ground truth model. So for example, this could be the Rescorla-Wagner model. And we also sample its parameters. Both of these are sampled from the so-called design prior. Then the ground truth model and its parameter values are used together with the proposed design to simulate a dataset. So this is, for example, the behavioral responses that we are simulating, for example, physiological responses or reaction times or decisions. And then we apply the same analysis that we are planning to apply to the data that we actually observe in the experiment that we will conduct. Now, having done the simulations, we can feed the results of those simulations into a utility function. The utility function is again a user-specified input into the method, and it is supposed to represent what are the research goals of the experiment. For example, if we want to do parameter estimation, then the utility function could take the result of the analysis, so the parameter estimate, and could take the ground truth parameter value and compare them. If, on the other hand, we wanted to do model comparison, then the utility function could take the model that is claimed as the winning model in the analysis and could take the ground truth model and see if they coincide. The utility function can also take directly the properties of the design. So for example, if our design specification included the number of trials, then the utility function could be used to try to make the experiments shorter, to say that every trial incurs an additional cost. Having designed the utility function, we can calculate the actual utility for each of the simulations, and then simply by averaging, or doing, in other words, Monte Carlo integration, we get the expected design utility of a particular proposed design. Lastly, we need to specify a way of searching for the optimal designs, or the designs that maximize expected utility. The first user input is the design space. The design space describes what are all the possible experiments that we are considering. So each point in this space corresponds to particular values of design variables. In the example of classical conditioning, each point corresponds to some probabilities of showing different cues and showing different outcomes, or in other words, the state transition probabilities of the Markov chain. How is this design space searched? Well, different optimization algorithms can be used here. But the general part is that the optimization algorithm picks a point in the design space. In other words, it proposes a particular design. Then this design is evaluated. And it is evaluated using the design prior, which is a probability distribution over models and their parameters that encodes our prior knowledge. Once the design is evaluated for simulations, we can calculate the expected design utility. And then this number is simply fed back to the optimization algorithm. This optimization loop then continues iteratively by the optimization algorithm proposing a design being evaluated, and the optimization algorithm receiving back an expected design utility, all the way until the termination criterion is reached. And this termination criterion is one of the optimization options that is also a user input. Finally, we obtain the optimized design. And here it's important to note that this is the best design that we have found, but it's not necessarily the globally optimal design. And in practice, we usually don't know whether this is or isn't the best possible design. Let us now look at what kind of results might we obtain if we used optimized designs instead of manual heuristic designs. In this example scenario, we want to do model comparison between the basic Rescorla-Wagner model and its probabilistic extension, the Kalman-Rescorla-Wagner model. The experimental design that has previously been suggested for disambiguating the predictions of these two models is called backward blocking, and this is what we will be using here as the reference or canonical design. And the results for this design are denoted with the orange color. We are comparing here this canonical design with two designs optimized with different prior knowledge or different design priors. In purple, we have the results for the design optimized under vague or non-informative prior. And in green, we have the results of the design optimized under perfectly informed prior, so where we know the parameters exactly, but we don't know the model. These two priors give us respectively the lower limit and the upper limit on what we can expect from an optimized design. Finally, we need to say what is the utility function, and here we chose model selection accuracy as the utility function. And model selection accuracy simply tells us how often do we choose as the winning model the model that actually generated the data. And of course, to assess this, we need to know the ground truth, so these results are obtained from simulations. Importantly, what you can see is that with optimized design, we can recover the true model almost perfectly, whereas with the canonical manual design, we could do so just slightly better than chance. Although these kinds of results in simulations are of course encouraging, there are some caveats, both practical and conceptual. So first of all, this kind of optimal experimental design problems can be quite computationally costly. However, that cost always needs to be weighted against the cost of non-informative experiments. Secondly, experiments that have many design variables can also be challenging to optimize. And lastly, the current software ecosystem is not yet very developed, but hopefully with more people interested in both developing and using these kinds of tools, this will improve. On the conceptual side, we have to remember that we can only optimize those variables to which our models are sensitive to. For example, learning models often don't account for perceptual differences. Second, we need to remember the good old garbage in, garbage out principle. So bad models in, bad priors in, bad experiments out. And finally, even though it may seem restrictive to specify the whole analysis in advance, which we need for experimental design, this can also be then used to pre-register the study, which is becoming more and more common anyway. At the end, I would like to sketch out some possible futures for OED, both in associative learning and in psychology more generally. One current problem when trying to employ optimal experimental design is that we don't yet use a very general formalism to describe experiments. This stands in contrast with modeling, where we can use, for example, probabilistic graphical models as a very general language to derive different classes of models. Therefore, in the future, we may leverage this analogy between experimental design and modeling to obtain a kind of grammar of experiments. At an even more general level, we may want to think not only about optimal experiments, but optimal environments, or in other words, environments that allow us to optimally infer the inner workings of different agents. And this idea that we will need optimized environments to understand complex behaviors is actually not new and was already proposed by Ross Ashby in the 1950s, who dubbed it the psychology of the environment. This brings me to the end of my presentation, where I just want to stress some main points. First of all, it's of course great to have a rich tradition of modeling like mathematical psychology has, but it's also important then to use optimal experimental design to be able to distinguish between these many models. Secondly, not only in associative learning but across many domains, optimal experimental design can bring substantial improvements compared to heuristic manual designs. And finally, I think if we wish to understand complex behaviors, I think we will also need complex optimized environments. With that, I wish to thank you for your attention, and if you're interested in finding out more about this topic, please check out the paper linked below.